Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Good day to you all. Welcome to In the Word, our lesson from the International Sunday School series. Dr. Roberts and I are glad that you've joined us, and we hope that you'll find this second lesson from the Gospel of Luke as interesting as we have.
Right.
The printed text includes a small section about the call of the fishermen disciples from the Gospel of Mark.
Mark chapter 1.
Right, before we get back into chapter Luke, to the chapter 14 of Luke. And this same calling story is going to be studied again in just a few weeks.
Lesson 5.
In this series. So what we've decided to do is postpone any treatment of this short Mark passage until then. And
we'll get into Matthew.
Yeah, I hope that doesn't confuse any of the teachers who listen to our lessons. But we'll recommend kind of postponing that because this very same incident will be addressed again very soon. So we're going to focus our attention on Luke chapter 14, that part of the printed text, and we'll find ourselves in the same section of Scripture as we were last week.
Chapter 14, a little further into the chapter.
Let's remind folks who may not have seen our last lesson just where we are in the Gospel of Luke here.
It's part of the emphasis from chapter 9, verse 51, where Jesus steadfastly set his face toward Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And even though we would think, if you're on a highway, it's a direct line.
Yeah.
It was not a direct line. It was what we would almost think of zigzag, but it was, the destination was there and was always in mind, that the cross was coming.
Yeah. So when it says he set his face to go to Jerusalem, he did not make a beeline for Jerusalem. Right. He could have gotten there very quickly, actually. But this is a journey of months, maybe even over a year. But the point, as you say, is Jesus' mental destination and ultimate destination is very much in his mind. Mm-hmm. And this passage that we're studying from Luke 14 today is fascinating because it shows his attempt to put the cross centrally in the thinking of his disciples as well. Mm-hmm. They didn't pick up on it very well, I don't think, but he's trying to make the cross a destination.
Yeah, the title for this lesson is Call to Sacrifice, where the previous lesson was Call to Serve. And the emphasis here is recognizing this is not just a lark.
Yeah,
we're on a mission with a goal that's costly.
Right. Now it is a mission, and it does involve a journey. And the goal is one thing, the destination is one thing, but the dynamic is another thing. The dynamic is following. Mm-hmm. And that we have to remember that's the key. It's not just the cross. It's not just the sacrifice. Right. As you mentioned in our conversation as we were preparing to talk through this lesson, Jesus isn't just trying to create a martyr complex among his disciples. I'm headed to the cross, you're headed to the cross.
Carry your cross. It's not just a suffering life, it's toward a purpose of following him.
It does involve sacrifice. We're not diminishing that. But the overarching goal is to follow Jesus every step of the way, including the steps that involve suffering, persecution, even perhaps death. Yeah. Well, we had a lesson just previous to this, also from chapter 14, where Jesus is talking about reaching out to the marginalized, and in between that lesson and this lesson, he's told another story about a banquet. As Jesus tells a lot of parables that involve meals, because a meal was such a central thing sociologically for them. He talks about someone who gives a banquet, and then people accept. They say they'll come, and then they'll back out.
Right, and have all kinds of excuses.
Right. Back in those days, before modern communication, you had to give people warning way in advance of an event.
It's interesting that recently there's been a trend of engaged couples sending a postcard, save the date.
Right. It is similar to that, isn't it?
Yeah.
So way in advance, months in advance, maybe more than that, you tell people to save the date, and then you later send out a more detailed, specific invitation, right?
And they were not so calendar conscious or watch conscious as we are, that they would tell the exact date or exact time. But the approximate time, and then when the word came, this is it.
Yeah, and then you were expected to come right away. And I have a little sympathy for the people who backed out. Sometimes when an event is way off in the future, you think, yeah, I'd like to go to that. That sounds good.
Right.
But when it comes right down to it, oh no, I've got so much going on now, I've committed myself to. So at any rate, so people did back out, and then the parable goes on to say that the person throwing the banquet tells the slave to go out and bring in
The poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. The same list we had before.
that same group.
Yeah.
And they have been invited, and then he says, well, go out into the roads, far afield, and compel people to come. Yeah. Some people interpret that parable as suggesting that not only should we invite the needy, who maybe don't come to mind at first, to the kingdom, but that we should also reach out to Gentiles. That third group, some people think referred to Gentiles. And unfortunately, that word compel led to some bad evangelistic strategies. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So at any rate, that's a famous parable that comes in between our last lesson and this lesson. But today we're going to start with Luke chapter 14, verse 25.
And the passage from Mark that we're leaving out is the calling of the disciples, and it was simply a matter of leaving the fish nets, leaving the job, leaving the family, leaving the boat, and turning to follow Jesus. But the passage that we're really emphasizing from Luke 14 again goes into much more depth about what it means to follow Jesus. And that's what I think we need to look at.
Yeah. Well, let's just read this passage then, Luke 14, beginning in verse 25. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, anyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, 'This person began to build and wasn't able to finish.' Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he's able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? And if he's not able, he'll send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything, you cannot be my disciples." Well, this is another important teaching about discipleship. The overall theme of our lesson series in this series is discipleship and mission. And we talked last week about how the mission of disciples is to make disciples. And here Jesus is definitely talking about discipleship. We see that word coming out in a couple of places, 26, 27, verse 33. Maybe we should define disciple. I don't think we did that last week.
It's a learner, a follower and learner.
Yeah. Literally, it's a word, an educational term that, as you say, means learner, one who learns. But in that culture, learning was not sitting in a lecture hall, taking notes from a lecturer. In a kind of a rabbinical setting, it involved a more interpersonal relationship, right?
And almost like an internship, an on-the-job experience.
Yes. So learning involved following. And so that's why we don't just translate disciple learner. Sometimes we translate it follower, but that kind of leaves out the learning part. And I don't know, maybe we should say learner follower or something.
But it's interesting, even in the English, the root word of discipline is disciple.
Yeah.
And it's a matter of disciplining yourself to learn from the one you're following.
Right. So it's a relational kind of learning. Yeah. Now the passage in verse 25 starts out with a reference to large crowds.
That's an important issue,
Yeah,
I think.
talk to us about that. What's the dynamic there?
It appears that the popularity of Jesus has grown to the point where large crowds are following him. And our tendency in our society is to think, go with the flow. You've got the crowds, you've got the people, emphasize what you've got. But Jesus begins to talk much more about what it means to be a disciple and the cost. And it's like he doesn't want rash, impulsive, just follow the crowd perspective. He's looking for those who are really committed followers of his.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And the popularity sometimes backfires big time on Jesus, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah. And so that idea of commitment. It says the crowds were traveling with Jesus, and that's a reminder of what we were talking about earlier. Jesus is on a journey. He's not, like the first year of his ministry, he seems to have been pretty settled in Capernaum up by the Sea of Galilee and just takes short trips out from
areas.
that. Yeah. But now, ever since Luke 9:51, he is definitely on a journey. It's a very circuitous journey, but it is a journey, and his popularity has brought large crowds out to be with him day by day, traveling with Jesus. So he turns and challenges them to take seriously what kind of followers they want to be. If anyone comes to me, and I don't want to overlook that. If anyone comes to me, that's where discipleship begins.
Right, coming
to Jesus.
Yes.
And I find it so interesting in Mark's account of the calling of the disciples. It begins this way, and he called them to be with him, and to preach the good news, and to heal the sick, and to cast out demons. And my mind just so quickly goes on to the tasks involved in discipleship, preaching and healing. But it starts with being with.
And I think that's such a key today. We have a tendency to think that if people will join the church or become a part of the fellowship, that's a critical issue. And it is. We need to be a part of the body. But ultimately, it's following Jesus. It's the commitment to Christ. And it's on that basis that the church, the body of Christ, becomes significant to us.
So it begins with a personal relationship and a personal commitment. And then out of that commitment flow the tasks of ministry.
And it's true that sometimes we come to know Jesus by being in the body and being in a fellowship where we learn more about him. But ultimately, the substance of our faith has got to be in Jesus.
So, Jesus said, if anyone comes to me, he understands that personal relationship is primary, and does not hate father, mother, wife, children, brother and sister, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple.
And hate is a strong word.
Help us with this word hate. Jesus is not calling us to hate, is he?
No. We know from the entirety of his ministry that he's calling us to love. And yet, as we look at the relationship with these others compared to Jesus, it's almost as if it were hate.
So Jesus is calling us to a primary loyalty to him,
Right.
which is so overarching and far-reaching in every area of our lives that every other relationship is secondary. And I think somewhat hyperbolically here, so with somewhat exaggerated language to capture our attention, Jesus says every other loyalty, every other relationship is going to feel almost like rejection or hatred compared to the loyal love that you need to show to me.
In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 10, he quotes Jesus a similar thing, saying, unless you love me more than these others, you're not worthy to be my disciple. And it's a matter of comparison and recognition that it's got to be ultimately greater to Christ than any other.
So here in Luke's Gospel, he uses the hyperbolic word hate to dramatically describe that lesser love that we have for everyone else compared to our love
It's interesting
for
that
Jesus.
Luke brings in wife and children, where the other Gospels, in quoting what Jesus said, don't mention that. And Luke includes sisters, brothers and sisters. So it's, again, characteristic of Luke.
Always includes the women.
Right.
He always includes the women, Now, not only does he kind of, with exaggerated dramatic language, describe hatred for these other close family members, he includes this teaching of Jesus, even their own life. And I wanted to point out, there are several words for life in the Greek language. This is not the word that means our aliveness. So he's not advocating suicide here or something. We should hate ourselves. But it is the word self, that life in that sense, self. And so self-focus is once again a concern of Jesus. We saw that in the last lesson. We were talking about we need to be other-focused rather than self-focused. Here, a person who is self-focused and has their strongest loyalty to themselves can't really be an effective disciple either. And this seems to be a theme that runs through this section of Jesus' teaching. Cannot be my disciple. Now, verse 27, we learn that just as Jesus has set his face to go to Jerusalem and is living life in the back shadow of the cross, he wants his followers,
whoever does not carry their cross and follow
carry
him.
their cross. Now, we have to learn about crosses. We do learn about crosses just through the story of the crucifixion of Jesus. What about the people who were listening to Jesus teach that day? Do they know what's coming?
They were very conscious of what a cross was. The Romans used the cross not just as ultimately an execution tool, but also a public control method, so that a person who was condemned to die would carry the cross through the public crowds to go to the place of execution. And it would be obvious this is what happens to people who who violate the kingdom. And so Jesus is talking about carrying a cross, and they knew what he was talking about.
Around A.D. 6, there had been a zealot uprising up in Galilee, and there would be a later zealot war in A.D. 66, which brings about a real full-scale war climaxed by the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. But there had been an earlier one, and A.D. 6, Jesus would have been about 10 years old. And many of the people who were following Jesus were probably his contemporaries, age-wise, and would have been children or teenagers or whatever back during that time. And according to contemporaneous historical accounts, thousands and thousands of Jewish Galileans who rebelled against Rome were arrested and crucified along the roads of Galilee. And the description is that the crosses were were standing thick as, we would say, telephone poles almost on the streets of Jerusalem, on the streets of Galilee, around where Jesus and the fishermen disciples grew up. I mean, most of Jesus' closest followers were Galileans, and maybe many of these crowds were as well. Anyway, I'm just illustrating your good point,
they knew what they were,
that they knew what a cross was, and they had walked beside rotting bodies hanging on crosses, and they had felt the thoroughly intimidating threat of Roman rule and Roman law, I guess, Roman retribution.
Yeah, we don't have anything comparable to that in our society. And when people talk about carrying their cross today, they sometimes mean unpleasant situations or tough times.
Yeah, I've got a little arthritis in my thumb here. That's carrying my cross.
Yeah.
Oh, these people knew what a cross was and knew what intense suffering and shame were connected to it.
But it's interesting also that in saying, unless you were willing to carry your cross and follow me.
Yeah.
It's not just having a life of suffering or being a martyr, but it's following Jesus.
Yeah.
That's the ultimate.
Yeah. And that's so important. This passage, this little teaching in 26 and 27 begins with come to me, and it ends with follow me. So whatever else is being talked about, your attitude toward those you love, your carrying of a cross, it's all in the context of an absolute relationship of following Jesus. Yeah. Now, starting with verse 28, he gives two little parables urging would-be followers to count the cost of discipleship, which is a kind of a little side note here. The cost of discipleship. The first one talks about financial cost. The parable does, of building a tower. Well, why would people have built towers in that day?
Well, they were used partly for fortresses, defense, but also on farms. They would build towers to watch over their crops and keep away marauders or whatever.
Yeah.
But it was really just a building project.
Yeah.
And before you start a building project, whatever it may be,
Yeah.
you better make sure you can finish it.
Jesus told several parables about thieves coming in and stealing agricultural produce and things like that. So they did actually build these guard towers. But you're right, the fact that it's a guard tower isn't the main point. It's a building project, and he says make sure before you lay the foundation you have enough financial resources to build the tower.
And he talks about that shame situation you were talking earlier.
Yes, right. At the end of 29, whoever sees your unfinished building will ridicule you, and that's the word or the concept shame. They'll snort at you is the meaning of the word. Then a second parallel parable is about a king counting the human cost of fighting a war with a neighboring king. And again, the Christian life is, I guess, mildly like building a building or going to war, but that's not really the point. The point is counting the cost and being able to follow through to finish.
And we were talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, The Cost of Discipleship, which for me was a very influential book when I was in college.
It was formative for me as well, and I don't know if it's on people's radar or not, if our viewers know about this book, but Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was a German theologian and preacher
and martyr
during the time of World War II, and he finally decided that it was his obligation as a spokesperson for the gospel of Jesus Christ to speak out against Hitler's atrocities, and he was arrested and imprisoned for a long period of time and eventually executed.
But the theme of the book is the quote that when Jesus calls someone to discipleship, he calls him to come and die. And that's
But the book, as we were saying earlier, the book isn't just about all Christians need to develop a martyr complex. It's the more positive view of following
Jesus.
Which is, after all, the climax of Jesus' teaching here in verse 33, where he says, in the same way, those of you who do not give up everything, you cannot be my disciples. There are a lot of negatives there, but the point is the cost of discipleship. The little passage from Mark that we chose to skip over, because we're going to treat it again in a couple of weeks, does talk about giving up things, right? Peter and John, as we'll Peter and Andrew, as we'll see, gave up their occupation.
Yeah, they were casting nets.
They were casting nets. They were preparing nets. They had a job to do on the Sea of Galilee, and they walked away from that.
Right.
And sometimes being a follower of Jesus demands that we walk away from things. But it's not just what we walk away from, is it?
Yeah.
It's always following Jesus. That's the ultimate goal. I think I've mentioned before in lessons that my father used to teasingly respond to the question, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus, by saying, I don't smoke and I don't chew and I don't go with girls that do. He didn't really mean that. He was kind of making fun of the notion that we sometimes communicate as Christians, that being a Christian, being a follower of Jesus, is all about what we give up, what we leave behind. And Peter and Andrew did leave behind an occupation.
Yeah, and James and John left their father and the boat and the hired men. They had quite a business, apparently.
That's true.
And they left it all. But
so they not only left a career, they left a relationship.
Yeah.
Which is reminiscent of Jesus' statement about hating father and mother, things like that.
But his point is, if you're going to be my disciple, you've got to count the cost and evaluate, are you really serious about this? And that's where the large crowds that we're following, there was a tendency just to get in with the crowd and do what the crowd's doing. And Jesus doesn't want that.
Yeah.
And as Christians, we've got to make sure people are really committed to Christ, Jesus himself.
So when it comes to discipleship, it's one thing to commit yourself to follow Jesus. It's another thing to follow through with Jesus.
Right. To follow through.
To really keep, there's going to come a time when Peter opposes Jesus' agenda about going to Jerusalem, going to the cross. He opposes it. And Jesus says, it doesn't literally say, get behind me, Satan. It says, go away from behind me. Well, behind me is where a disciple stands. Behind me is where a follower stands. So what Jesus is saying is, if you're not willing to face the cross with me, then you're not ready to follow me. If you're not ready to follow through, then you're not ready to follow.
And that illustrates that this commitment to follow Jesus is not a one-time only decision we make. It's a continuous thing. That you mentioned last week that the disciples in the upper room were still arguing about who's the greatest, and there's still a need to follow him, not ourselves.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us for our conversation about this scripture today. I hope you'll join us as we recommit ourselves to not only following Jesus, being disciples in a very personal, intentional way, but also following through on a lifelong journey of discipleship, carrying a cross, but keeping our focus on Christ. Hope you'll join us again next week. Have a great week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.